Fanboys and fangirls everywhere love to share their thoughts on and discuss the stories and properties they love, and I am no exception. This is the series where I share various opinions, talk about interesting little tidbits I've noticed, pose questions, and analyse different aspects of the things I love. Welcome to the Fan Ramblings. Wow, this video is so late. Yeah, real life's been getting in the way a lot recently, but nevertheless, here I am, back again to give my thoughts on the latest batch of episodes from Doctor Who Series 10. This time, in an effort to catch up with ourselves a bit more promptly, we'll be covering 4 episodes instead of 3. The Pyramid at the End of the World, The Lie of the Land, Empress of Mars, and The Eaters of Light. So, without further ado, and in order to keep the runtime down as much as humanly possible, let's dive straight into it. So, The Pyramid at the End of the World then. I think this episode has to go alongside Oxygen as one of the best of Series 10 so far. Thinking about it, not a lot really happens, but there's this tangible sense of intrigue inherent in its premise. There's a 5,000-year-old pyramid in Turkmenistan that wasn't there yesterday. Doctor Who thrives on mystery, and many of its episodes are based around the Doctor having to figure out what exactly is going on before he can figure out exactly how to fix it. Pyramid is a prime example of such an episode, but when you think about it, it accomplishes this in kind of an unusual way. It tells the audience exactly what's going on quite early, so the whole time the Doctor's trying to figure it out, the audience already knows the answer. I mean, come on, as soon as you see the lab, you know where this is going. Nothing ever goes right in a lab in a sci-fi story. That's just fact. The episode creates suspense by making the audience wait for the moment that the Doctor discovers the answer himself, steadily drawing things out just enough to make the climax as close a call as it can be, which is, of course, inherently more exciting to watch, without making the episode feel too slow. It's quite ingenious in its own way, and makes for an interesting change from having to wait for the answers like normal. However, none of that is to say that you know what's going to happen before it does. The volatility and fearfulness of the soldiers, driving them to question and then ignore the Doctor, accepting the deal, makes you unsure as to how exactly things are about to go down, so there's suspense there too. Peter Harness is truly in his element writing politically tense situations, and all the better for Doctor Who fans. And there's nothing more suspenseful than seeing a ticking clock count you down to annihilation, so that was a nice touch too. It was so satisfying watching the clock go back once the Doctor's actions began to take effect. It is definitely my favourite part of the Monk trilogy, which, as I've said, wasn't an idea that entirely grabbed me initially, but this episode really made for the most intriguing watch, and it totally paid off. The monks themselves are, I think, definitely at their most interesting in this part too. The concept of a conquering race needing the permission of its intended subjects is so original. I can't think of anything else I've seen that's quite like that. They need to exploit the genuine love of the indigenous species before they can take over, which is a really interesting idea. They're the first monsters in Series 10 to really make me go, wow, that's so cool, which is a relief after having opened the series with a living puddle. What Moffat and the Moffat era do best is create truly unique concepts for monsters, whether it's shadows that kill or memory-proof aliens. So the lack of truly standout ideas in the first half of Series 10 was a bit of a letdown in hindsight. Though they didn't really get to do anything or show themselves off much in Extremis, here is where the monks really shine, and this is where they really grabbed me personally. There are some nitpicks I could make, being me, such as, how stupid is this scientist? I mean, yeah, of course it would be Brian from My Parents Are Aliens who brings about the end of the world, but really, how is he still employed at this stage? At least he only got himself killed. Normally, in real life, it'd have been the innocent one who'd have gotten it in the neck. Speaking of whom, it's nice that Erica is handled the way she is. She's the latest example of Doctor Who doing representation right, by not making a huge thing out of people's differences, just treating them equally. While her size does, in one sense, and I mean this in the most inoffensive way possible, make her different to other characters, there's no big deal made of it. Nobody even mentions it. It's like nobody's noticed. And that's a good thing. Her size is not the defining trait of her character, just as Bill's sexuality isn't the defining trait of hers. She's not the midget character, she's the responsible scientist character. Bravo, Doctor Who! Bravo! Getting back to the nitpicks though, the only other one I really have is with the ending. I don't think it's been confirmed anywhere, certainly not anywhere I've seen, but I do get the impression that the episodes of the Monk trilogy all started out as separate standalone stories, much in the same way Face the Raven was originally written as a standalone adventure, before being altered by script revisions and redrafts into a lead-in for the finale. What I think happened behind the scenes is this. Peter Harness wrote Pyramid with the monks as the villains, and then Toby Whithouse wrote The Lie of the Land, featuring a different set of villains. Then, somebody spotted how you could easily link the two plots together based on their shared idea of subjugating humanity. So the monks ended up replacing Whithouse's original villains. And finally, Stephen Moffat, having overseen all this, and having the idea in his head for an episode where it all turns out to have happened within a simulation the whole time, went and wrote Extremis as a prelude to the next two stories. If I'm right in my speculation, then the obvious plot hole in the cliffhanger is sure evidence of this, just like the holes in Face the Raven's ending were evidence of when it happened there too. What plot hole, you may ask? Well, following the internal logic of the series, the sonic screwdriver uses sound to essentially jiggle mechanisms within a lock until they move and unlock the door, right? So surely it could have done the same with the combination lock. You know, just used sound to jiggle the wheels around until they locked into the correct position, thus unlocking the door. I've got to admit, I don't entirely buy what they're trying to sell here. It's so annoying, because the rest of the episode's so good. Even Dippy the scientist, being indisputably the worst scientist ever, you can just sort of laugh off, because he's so bad it is just funny. But with this bit, you end up with the same problem as with Face the Raven's ending. You've ended up undermining the entire chain of events that follows on from this point, because this is an inciting incident that could have been easily avoided simply by the writers following the pre-established internal logic of the series. Long story short, The Lie of the Land ends up suffering the same fate as Heaven Sent and Hellbent, being both a really good episode, yet also one that shouldn't even exist. I'm willing to bet there's another version of Pyramid somewhere that ends with the Doctor defeating the monks and them running away, or flying away, in their big old pyramid spaceship. I will say this though, it made sense that the Shades couldn't show the Doctor the numbers on the wheels, and it was cleverly set up with the iPad earlier on in the episode. I'm assuming that wasn't just a happy accident. Something else that's nice about the ending is that Bill actually gets to do something worthy of discussion. Looking back on Series 10 prior to this point, I don't think she's had a whole lot to do or contribute to the action of many of the plots. She got rid of the living puddle in the pilot, and gave the Doctor his order in thin ice, but that's really been about it. And both of those things are pretty safe, non-controversial things. They're the sort of things you can expect any companion to do. Here, she finally gets to do something a bit more controversial. After all that worrying about how the three soldiers were going to cock everything up, it ended up being Bill who doomed the Earth to live under the monks' rule. On one hand, she did the right thing by saving the Doctor, because, well, it's the Doctor. He can always fix things later. And if it were your friend you had to choose between with the Earth, would you really make a different decision? It would be so hard to sacrifice your own friend for a greater good like that, however obvious the logic would be. On the other hand, however, she arguably made the wrong choice by blatantly ignoring the Doctor's own wishes, and for all she knew, dooming the Earth. Understandably, many would consider handing our planet over to hostile alien species looking to enslave us to be a bad move. All the modern era companions have been controversial in some way, or done something controversial at some point. So, as much as I don't like to see controversy, on the other hand, it is quite nice to see Bill continue that trend. Otherwise, you just have all of her most elitist fans being all like, oh well, she's the only one who never did anything wrong. When, actually, she debatably did. If some of them are going to be controversial, then it's only fair that they're all controversial. I'm aware that that's kind of weird logic and kind of a weird way of looking at it, but shut up, it makes sense to me. Like Oxygen, this is another pretty well balanced episode between plot and character material. There's not a lot character-wise that happens with Nardole this episode, but it was nice to see Penny make another appearance though. It was nice to see something a bit different with the recap sequence, by framing it within the idea of Bill literally telling someone else in the story what happened last week, and the way that the real life date is interrupted in virtually the exact same way as the simulated date not only makes for a fun running gag or comedic parallel, but also just goes to show how advanced and accurate the monk simulation really was. As for the Doctor, he gets to have his usual badass hero-villain talk with the head monk, which is as suspenseful and chilling as you could ever want it to be. Capaldi, as ever, maintaining his steely tough guy aura that suits this Doctor so well. Looking back over the New Who Doctors, Eccleston was the angry one, Tennant was the cool one, Smith was the dorky one, and Capaldi is the badass one, that's for sure. And I love the way he deduces the monk's plan. While he came to the conclusion of something to do with bacteria, probably a bit too quickly for me personally, the way he tricks the monks into showing him which lab they're watching is so clever, and so much the sort of tactic the Doctor would use. He also has a poignant opening monologue about how the smallest decisions can have the biggest effect on things. Something as simple as one drink too many on the wrong night with your mates, or an accident with your reading glasses, can literally lead to the actual end of the world. The imagery they use really runs this point home, and the episode is, in this respect, ingeniously plotted to reinforce this idea. It really does make you think. But what was particularly interesting with the Doctor this week, though, was how you get to see him emotionally vulnerable for a change. He's scared by the power of the monks. He's the only one who's already seen it, thanks to the last episode. As Bill points out, he becomes the only one still fighting, in a room full of soldiers, which is an unusual place for the Doctor of all characters to be in, and also demonstrates a complete role reversal from Series 9's Zygon story. I think it's pretty well justified though. We've seen on many occasions that the Doctor isn't always very good at practicing what he preaches, so while it does feel a bit wrong seeing him act like this, that's kind of the point. Nor is it really a portrayal of a character. There's a nice bit of drama between him and Bill when even she questions his approach to the situation, which lends itself to be a nice little setup for her taking the monk's deal at the end of the episode. That's probably one of the only slightly predictable parts of the episode, really. As soon as the Doctor goes to stop the contagion from spreading, you know something's going to go wrong that will result in Bill accepting the monk's offer. But all in all, I thought the pyramid at the end of the world was a pretty awesome episode, albeit one with a few flaws, particularly regarding its setup for the following adventure. For these reasons, I'd probably give it second place behind Oxygen this series. Speaking of the next adventure, let's talk the Lie of the Land. It's funny, because I don't really feel like there's anything particularly wrong with this episode. I can tell it's a decent contribution, but I kind of feel like I should like it more than I do. I don't hate it by any means, but there's just something about it that just isn't quite clicking with me. I don't feel as into this one as I was, say, Pyramid or Oxygen. The episode certainly starts off in an interesting place, with the Doctor having already lost. The invaders are here and have subjugated humanity almost completely, altering their memories and perception of the world to make them think the monks had always been there. And with the trailers and synopsis teasing that even the Doctor's joined the monks, either as part of the brainwashing or by his own volition, you certainly entered the episode wondering how exactly he and or his companions were going to turn the tables. This brings us to what's undoubtedly Pearl Mackie's single best scene in the series so far. After months of fighting to keep the monks out of her head, hoping that the Doctor will come back and fix everything, she's faced with a man who has seemingly gone back on everything he believed in, taught her to believe in, and it breaks her. She is crushed and heartbroken and angry, and it's just such a powerful scene to watch. It's a powerful performance from Pearl, and easily one of the best parts of the episode. As a scene, it also demonstrates how utterly ruthless Capaldi's Doctor can be. In an act that echoes his abandonment of Clara in Deep Breath, the Doctor completely crushes Bill and robs her of all hope, even to the point of manipulating her into shooting him, all just to test her and be sure she wasn't being controlled by the monks. It was all a tactic, part of his strategy, and he doesn't really apologise for any of it. Of course, some will argue that we all knew the regeneration would be a fake, but considering Capaldi's teases that this particular one won't be straightforward, it was at least an outside possibility that this could have been for real in some way. I did think it was a good decision to immediately turn the scene round and play it for a few laughs afterwards though. It was a very heavy, dramatic scene, and I can totally see very young children finding it troubling or upsetting. And after all, how would you feel if you saw your hero acting like this at a young age? While you do have to write in things that aren't nice to keep the show exciting and dramatic, you do have to be careful with a family show like Doctor Who that you don't go too far in any way. After pushing it probably as far as they dare, they reel it back with a few jokes and what have you to make the kids feel better and reassure them that it was all just an act. I think this was a very important decision that they made, and I applaud them for that. However, this scene wasn't the only winning conversation scene of the episode. The Doctor is, at last, forced to open the vault and consult Missy for information. This is going to set up a trend in the following episodes. Any scene featuring Missy immediately becomes the best of the episode. Michelle Gomez's performance is definitely more toned down, on the whole at least, than in Series 8 and 9, which, depending on your point of view, will either be the best thing or worst thing about the character's appearances so far this year. Personally, I just find it interesting, and I think it makes sense that after years and years of being locked inside the vault, that she would naturally have calmed down a bit. It's great fun watching her and the Doctor play off against each other as she coaxes him along the way to his conclusions. You can feel them pushing each other, encouraging each other. There's such a tangible energy between them, it's unreal. Here we learn that the Doctor's been trying all this time to teach Missy how to be good, with varying levels of success. While she has seemingly evolved as a character, she's not just conveniently and unrealistically completely changed. She still retains her cold, ruthless edge, as we see when her answer is to kill the person who is the link to the monks. She doesn't even apologise or show sympathy of any kind to Bill when she finds out it's her who's the link, and before she does anything, she tries to haggle with the Doctor for material things she wants in return for helping. And she makes a good point about the subjective nature of good. Just because she's not being as liberal and idealistic as the Doctor, that doesn't necessarily make her bad, especially not as she's just given him the answer to saving the world, which she very easily could have chosen not to do. Not being heroic isn't inherently villainous. It's not long after this scene that we come to the conclusion of the episode, and it was certainly a tense watch. You have a brilliantly effective battle scene between the Doctor's troops and the monks, with the only sound being the recording Bill's made, playing on repeat. It's really atmospheric having everything else removed, especially the music. No offense to Murray Gold, of course. The resolution itself is an interesting one. The Doctor, as an alien, doesn't really have any superpowers as such, but does have certain telepathic abilities that we've seen numerous times throughout the show. Not only was it interesting to see his brain power used as a means to defeat the monks, but also to see that theirs is actually more powerful. Because of the multitude of powers and the breadth of knowledge the Time Lords possess, they're essentially able to do anything. For all intents and purposes, they're basically gods, so it's easy for the Doctor to come across this way by extension. You quite often end up seeing him as the most powerful being in the room, so to see him literally floored by the monk's superior power was actually quite refreshing to see, not to mention troubling. These are creatures that can trump even a Time Lord in a mind-bending contest. That's not good news. And so it falls to Bill to save the day, which she does so with the memory she's created for herself of her mum. I think this made a lot of sense as a resolution, given the context of the threat. She overpowered false memories created by the monks, using a memory she herself created, yet still felt true and real. It was quite a touching and, in its own way, rather poignant point. This does highlight a point of contention for me though, given that Whithouse was the one who wrote Under the Lake from Series 9, which I've said before in previous videos is one of the worst culprits for getting Clara's character wrong. It really stung to see such a great and competent writer like Whithouse cock up a great character, and my favourite companion, by having her behave basically appallingly from start to finish for an entire two-parter, no less. Here, in a single episode, he takes Bill, an okay character, and has her behave like a model companion the whole time. I know this is incredibly petty of me, but it just really rubs salt into the wounds. God damn it, Whithouse. But anyway, getting back to the point, I think this ending's also the first time since dealing with Heather at the end of the pilot that Bill's really gotten to play an active role in the story to any significant degree. While she does have key parts to play in Smile and Thin Ice, it's still the Doctor who actually does all the day saving. The same is true of Knock Knock, Oxygen, Extremis, and the Pyramid at the End of the World. As I've said, her only active involvement in the last example is to immediately undo the Doctor's efforts and doom the entire world. So it was good, I think, to see her redeem herself here by saving the entire world. However, while that problem is combated, there still remains no real story for Bill in this episode. The episode focuses a lot on her and her struggles with the current problem, but I don't really feel like any of it really progresses her overall story, the ongoing journey she's supposed to be on. What is she supposed to be learning from travelling with the Doctor? What is she gaining from these experiences that she didn't have when she started out? I've never really gotten the impression that she felt anything was lacking in her life before the Doctor, so what does she get out of it? What does she have, or rather not have, that she can develop, or is supposed to be developing? I've got more to say on this, but I'll save that for later. Overall, it was a nice heartfelt ending, especially with the Doctor's comments that he only puts up with the rest of stupid humanity because of the 1 in a million person who's actually a little bit smart. You don't get many moments of warmth from Capaldi's Doctor, but that's what makes him so good and special. I do have one nitpick to make though about the whole status quo reset that comes in the form of the monks wiping themselves from the memories of humanity. It really reminded me how much I miss the continuity of the Russell T Davies era, where people actually remembered when Earth got invaded. Yes, it did happen a lot during the Russell T Davies era, but the rate's been reduced since Moffat took over, so there's no reason not to have continued it on. It's one of the few things I don't like about the Moffat era. I'm really starting to wonder whether or not there'll be any reference to the events of Death in Heaven once the Cybermen roll around again in the finale, seeing as that story would have been set in 2016, just 1 year prior to the present day of Series 10. I'm pretty well convinced that if Bill didn't know what Dalek was when she saw one, she probably won't know what a Cyberman is either, but they only invaded her planet a short period of time before she would have met the Doctor in the pilot. continuity my foot. It occurs to me that The Lie of the Land is another episode where not a lot actually happens, which I suppose is fair given the 45-minute runtime, but I kind of feel like it's different here for some reason. Maybe it's the fact that there's so much travelling around that gets skipped over and covered by Bill's narration. Though the character's voice has grown on me since the beginning of the series, or rather I've just gotten used to it, I guess, I still find there are certain moments where it can be grating. So having her for a narrator, while not terrible, isn't exactly amazing either, for me personally. That's not an attack or hate or anything like that, it's just how my ears feel. Anyway, the episode can pretty much be broken down into 3 major scenes: Bill's confrontation with the Doctor aboard the boat, speaking to Missy, and defeating the monks at the climax. Everything else feels a bit like stitching, just holding the bigger pieces together. Perhaps you could say that about a lot of episodes, I don't know, but for some reason I can't quite put my finger on. It just feels particularly irksome here. All in all, I found The Lie of the Land, nice title by the way, to be decent, but just not my favourite of this series. Like I said before, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it, it's just not one for me. It's broadcasting on a slightly different wavelength to the one I'm tuned to, I guess you could say, if you want to get poetic about it. And so we come to episode 9, Empress of Mars. I thought this one was really good, though not quite great. It's certainly a solid standalone piece. Interestingly, both Ice Horror episodes of the modern era are among Gatiss' strongest contributions to the show. If you ask me, I'd say they make up 2/3 of his top 3 episodes, along with the Crimson Horror. Maybe we should get him to just write Ice Warrior stories from now on. I don't think he'd particularly complain somehow. I'm glad he didn't go the route of making it a spiritual sequel to the Perdon stories of the Pertwee era, making it about Britain's vote to leave the EU. It's such a sensitive political topic, which I'm not getting into, this is a politics-free zone, that it would just end up being yet another controversial episode, when I think we could all do with some more unanimous classics in our lives. There'd also been the danger of the Doctor potentially being seen to take sides, which would have caused a riot just by itself. So I think the decision to play it safe and just make it a fun adventure yarn in the spirit of classic adventure novels was the best one they could have made, in my opinion. The episode they did make, though, has a fantastic starting point. Victorian soldiers on Mars. How appropriately time-bending for a show like this. I gotta admit, I was expecting something a bit more timey-wimey. I was genuinely surprised when that didn't happen. But the plot works well enough as is, and it is all explained properly, so that's all good at least. The episode also answered a little tidbit that I've been pondering for a while now. How come we only ever visit alien planets in the present or future? We basically never go to one in the past, so popping over to Mars in 1881 was actually quite a nice change of pace. It's a small thing, but it made me smile, and it's something I can tick off my personal checklist now, so that's nice. The opening scene at NASA was quite fun too. It's always good to see a bit of the life the Doctor intends to lead, just seeing the sights and discovering cool new stuff. It's quite a fun scene and just what we needed after a slightly heavier episode the week before, with its big dramatic and emotional scenes. The Doctor's smile as the words "God Save the Queen" are revealed written across the surface of Mars is so perfect. It just screams of the delight he feels at the sight of a mystery to solve, which in turn highlights his life as an adventurer rather than a superhero. And it's such a great mystery to set up too. It's not super convoluted or layered or anything like that. It's just a simple clash between two completely separate things that can't possibly go together. It's like a one-episode version of the Impossible Girl mystery. Something seemingly impossible has occurred, but it doesn't require a great deal of work or even detail to set up and explain. You can just look at it and immediately understand it. It's a perfect example of less being more. Bravo, Gatiss! I was a little bit disappointed not to see the traditional orange spacesuit though. Obviously, the visual design of Doctor Who has been, and continues to be, constantly changing. But that's kind of what I liked about always seeing the exact same spacesuit get pulled out of the wardrobe each time. I always thought it was kind of funny that this was like the one thing that never changed. And then they went and changed it. Goddamn soft reboot. But you know what? It's not like that's an important detail. So let's get on to the things that are, shall we? The two main Ice Warrior characters, I thought, were great fun to watch, and you can tell Gatiss wrote them to embody everything that is most interesting about the Martians. They could slaughter whole civilizations yet weep at the crushing of a flower is probably my favourite line about them, and I think it sums them up perfectly as a race that isn't really purely good or evil, like the Daleks for example. They just are who they are. They are conquerors, but not without a sense of honour either. They're not just mindless destroyers, they appreciate beauty when they see it, and have things that they value too. I love that Friday spends most of the episode as a neutral party in the proceedings. He's trying to stop the fighting as much as the Doctor is. This is never more clear than when they're both trying to reason with Iraxa. Friday is obviously dedicated to his own species and Queen because they're part of him, and it's also a question of honour. However, he knows he has no quarrel with the human soldiers either, and you could even argue that he's developed some sense of camaraderie with them. While he's obviously gone to extreme lengths and bent the truth in some places to serve his queen and species, he's not just following them blindly either. If he were, he'd have gone to Iraxa, not the Doctor and Bill. It might be a cliche, but I love characters that fall into the honourable warrior category, and I think Friday sits right in there quite comfortably. Interestingly, there's a somewhat Victory of the Daleks-esque element to the plot, with the Doctor initially being suspicious of Friday, who is of course posing as a servant. That's not a criticism, just an observation. Thought it was kind of funny. You could probably say that many of the things about Friday are also true of Iraxa, the titular Empress of Mars. Although she's clearly a more instinctively hostile personality, she's still willing to stop and listen to people when they're talking sense. I love how she completely ignores the fact that Bill is a different species to her, to ask for her opinion as a woman. It doesn't matter what she is, just who she is. Good guy, bad guy, threat or ally. This is probably one of my favourite scenes, and it gives you a quick yet interesting insight into her character. The Victorian characters I didn't find as interesting, largely because I think most of them were really just cannon fodder. I do love their character names though, and I really enjoyed some of their dialogue. I think Gatiss probably really enjoyed writing a lot of their lines. I suppose some could argue that some of the names and dialogue for the soldiers are maybe a bit cheesy or stereotypical Victorian, but I think this story being a kind of homage to classic adventure novels as well as a love letter to Ice Warriors makes it the kind of story where you can get away with that, where it's actually a benefit rather than a hindrance. Of course, the incongruous imagery of Victorian soldiers in their old scarlet uniforms running around the caves of Mars is Doctor Who all over, and really justifies the Zulu comparisons people have drawn with the episode. Moving on to the regular characters, we have the Doctor facing rather an interesting dilemma, with the humans being the invaders for once, yet he's still compelled to protect them because they're still the ones who are going to get slaughtered. It's an unusual position for him to be in, protecting the invaders rather than the indigenous species like he normally would. I don't think this ended up being quite as prominent a plot point as the official synopsis implied, but there is at least one moment dedicated to it, and it does get you thinking about the position he's stuck in this week. Beyond that, the Doctor ends up playing his usual role of being the guy stood between two opposing parties trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the unfolding mess, which rarely gets old, if ever. Bill gets to contribute again with her insights, and by providing one of the biggest yes moments of Series 10, but at this point, you can probably guess what I'm going to say about her. I don't hate her by any means, it just doesn't feel like she's progressing anywhere. Like I said, I'll elaborate on that point later. Once again, there's not really much Nardo either, largely because he's sidelined in order to deal with the subplot this week. namely the TARDIS's still currently mysterious malfunction. This was probably largely done for the same reasons as the activation of the HADs in Cold War, to get around the obvious question of why not just get in the TARDIS and leave, but it ends up becoming a whole goldmine of plot possibilities. Could this be the Master's work? Trying to get the Doctor killed before he can interfere with his evil plot in the finale? Or possibly just looking to delay him in some way? Of course, Nardole does the only thing one can really do when dealing with a malfunctioning time capsule. Consults the Time Lord, or in this case, Time Lady, as the only Gallifreyan who's around is of course Missy, still locked up downstairs in the vault. While it's obviously only a brief part of the episode, it makes for an interesting dilemma for Nardole, especially after having vowed that Missy would be going nowhere as long as he was still around, at the end of Thin Ice. That could have just been a happy accident, but I'd like to think this was a deliberate setup. If it was, nicely done, guys. In a way, it's kind of a shame we didn't get to see more of this in the episode, because this would have been really interesting to see. Not just the dilemma itself, but just Nardole and Missy by themselves without the Doctor. Who knows how many attempts it took to get back to Mars. Don't know about anyone else, but I'm dying to see the unseen adventures of Missy and Nardole. Here you go, Big Finish. There's a future spin-off for you. You're welcome. Of course, Nardole has no choice but to let Missy out, which naturally creates waves with the other two members of Team TARDIS. You can certainly see things begin to escalate in the run-up to the finale. First came the reveal via flashback in Extremis, then the meeting with Missy inside the vault in Live Land, and now here, she's finally let out of the vault, which is naturally a massive bombshell, as Nardole has just done the thing he spent the whole series chastising the Doctor about. They've just spent the past 8 episodes going on about how this must never happen, though they fail to fully elaborate why exactly. Nardole's the character who's been the most determined to keep her in, and ends up being the one to let her out. I suppose that's meant to be poetic, I guess. It certainly makes for a juicy, ironic turnaround, which is always great to see. But that just brings me right back around to the fact that it was kind of a shame we didn't get to see this elaborated on a bit more. Not that the main plot wasn't interesting as well, it just would have been nice to see a bit more balance between the two. But then I suppose they needed the time for all the stuff on Mars, so what are you gonna do? What's intriguing about Missy, given what little we see of her in this episode, is how she reacts to the Doctor. She's perfectly fine and completely understanding about having to be locked back up in the vault upon their return, which is perplexing in itself, given how oddly cooperative that is of her. But what got my gears turning was the way she was so concerned for the Doctor's well-being. Obviously they are friends, which is probably what this was meant to highlight. She's naturally just worried about how he is after this most recent ordeal, but she seems so concerned to me that it got me wondering whether or not the Doctor is already regenerating, for some as yet unrevealed reason. Remember the teasers about this one not being straightforward, and Tennant's Doctor was able to hold his regeneration in for a bloody long time. If, and that's one hell of a big if, this is true, is the Doctor intentionally, consciously holding it back, or has something gone wrong? That would explain the vaguely worried expression he had on his face in Knock Knock when the topic came up, almost as though he already knows what's coming for him. In a lot of ways, the scene with Missy, as with Live Land before it, ends up being the best part of the episode, if not one of the best. I mean, I have as much to say about all that as I do the entire rest of the episode. That's gotta count for something. The other contender would have to be the surprise Pertwee era connections at the end, just before Nardole and Missy turn back up with the TARDIS. Alpha Centauri, the hermaphrodite hexapod itself from the Peladon tales of the 70s, makes a surprise appearance at the end of the episode, setting up the Ice Warriors' appearances in those stories and placing Empress of Mars as a kind of soft prequel to them. It was a really nice touch, made all the better by them even going so far as to bring back the original voice actress, from out of retirement no less. Isan Churchman, you are a 92-year-old badass, and I salute you. I actually love the people who made this happen. It just makes the connection that little bit more authentic. Thanks guys. you more than earned your paycheck on this one. But even if you subtract the whole Missy Nardole TARDIS malfunction subplot and the classic era Easter egg at the end, I thought Empress of Mars was a really good watch. It's not necessarily a modern classic, or even the biggest, most elaborate, or most influential episode of the modern era, but it is jolly good fun, and sometimes that's all you need. And so, we finally come to the Eaters of Light. While not the first contribution a classic era writers made to New Who, this was the first TV episode to be written by one, so anticipation was high. Not just because the writer in question had worked on the classic era before, but because this was Rona Munro, the woman who wrote Survival, the last ever classic era TV serial. This episode was quite possibly the most anticipated of the whole bunch. So, did it live up to the hype? Well, I think that's probably the latest case of it depends who you ask. I thought it was okay, but it didn't really blow me away. To be honest, I'm not so sure I've got all that much to say about it. I think for me, this is another case like Lie of the Land, where it's not necessarily a bad episode, it's just not one that's entirely for me. I think it was nice for Capaldi and Moffat to do a proper Scottish episode before they both leave the series. I didn't realise Rona Munro was Scottish too. They must keep her in reserve for whenever it's the final series of an older Scottish accented Doctor. Of course, Capaldi gets the best line of the episode. It's Scotland, it's supposed to be damp. Upon rewatching the episode, it occurred to me that it was an interesting choice to have an alien animal rather than an alien person as the threat. It was appropriate for the wild and untamed nature of the setting, and it makes the story not one about good versus evil, as it usually is, but rather one of just pure survival. No pun intended. I thought the design of the creature was great. It was a proper alien-looking entity, as opposed to many alien designs in Doctor Who, which still look quite human-y, largely down, in most cases, to the practicality of an actor having to wear it as a costume. With this creature being a completely CGI creation, they had a bit more license to go all out on it, and it really shows. I love the tendrils it has that can just shoot out and grab you. I don't think I've ever seen a mammalian-looking creature on all fours with firing tendrils like that before. Not that I can think of off the top of my head, anyway. It occurs to me that the manner of deaths in both this episode and Empress of Mars are actually pretty gruesome for a family show, though still not as bad as Cassandra's death. That's not a complaint, but they probably don't want to push it much further than this. The show already gets bombarded with complaints that it's gotten too scary for kids, so we probably don't want to add any more fuel to that fire. I thought Munro made quite a clever use of the TARDIS translation circuit in the theme of understanding, making it both literal and metaphorical. When the circuit kicks in, one of the major barriers, one of the major differences between the Picts and the Romans is stripped away, and they begin to realise how similar they are to each other. They're both just packs of scared children, forced to deal with a situation no adult should have to endure, let alone them. It's a clever new way of bringing to the fore one of Doctor Who's most steadfast themes. Talking breeds understanding, breeds companionship, as well as introducing the new companion to one of the main elements of the overall show. Having said that though, I do have just one question about this. How is Bill only just finding out about the translation circuit now? She's been travelling with the Doctor for how long by this point? Isn't she supposed to be the questiony one? The one that asks all the really good and or difficult questions? Sorry, nitpicking again. But my point was that Munro used the circuit in a cool new way that was pretty clever, so well done on that, Rona. The time-distorting Ken was a cool idea too, though it seemed like a bit of a cheat regarding 2-day time jump. Just how did Nardole win the Picts over in the end? To the point that they'd help him look for Bill and listen to his stories. It's not a major issue. When you've only got 45 minutes to work with, you're allowed to cut corners in some areas. Still, I think that would have to be a story all by itself. Nardole and the Picts. Make a nice little short story. I kind of feel like this is another episode that leans more towards the plot end of the storytelling spectrum, but there are still plenty of good character moments in the episode. I think in some ways the guest cast actually get a better deal than the regulars do, especially Rebecca Benson as Car. You feel sad for all the kids in this episode, but particularly Car, because she's scared and defensive and young and has no idea what she's really doing, and yet finds herself in a position of leadership, all of which also applies to Lucius, creating a parallel between the two that later becomes the point of the episode. As a result of all this stuff she's dealing with, she basically created the mess the characters are currently in, so she has to face up to that, which naturally is no easy thing to do. But of course, that's exactly what she does, refusing to allow the Doctor to pay for her mistakes. She's outwardly angry, but inwardly quite sweet and vulnerable, which really makes you feel for her in particular. You feel equal measures sad and proud to see her, and the others of course, sacrifice themselves for the greater good. It was nice to see Bill demonstrate again what she's learned from the Doctor, in moments such as giving the Romans a pep talk, telling them that hiding isn't a plan. Those are words you can just hear the Doctor saying. It was interesting to see her actually being more practical than the Doctor for a change, telling him after she stopped him sacrificing himself for the second time this series that he has other responsibilities, like the Vault, and that he can't fight every battle. Of course, one of the talking points of this episode has to be the whole thing with the crows being able to talk. Depending on your taste, this is an element that's either going to make the episode or break it for you. And really, Moffat doesn't have anything to lose by letting Munro include it in the final product. He's going anyway, so if people turn around and think it's dumb, who cares, right? To me, it seems like something that might have been pulled from Scottish folklore or something. Forgive me, I don't know anything about Scottish folklore. Anyway, personally, I thought it was kinda weird, even by Doctor Who's ever-eccentric standards, but it added a nice touch to the ending with Car's name and what have you, so that was nice. To be honest, if there's any show in the universe that can pull off a talking crow, it's Doctor Who, hands down. That's easily one of the reasons I love the show so much. Interestingly, this episode ends much the same way that Empress of Mars did, on a scene with Missy. Here, it's revealed that as a reward for helping them last week, the Doctor now no longer has Missy locked up in the vault, but the TARDIS instead, having been locked out of the controls, naturally. She is now his maintenance woman, which, when you think about it, is a very interesting position for her to find herself in. Missy is the mistress, the master, so called because she wants to be the one in charge, and yet here she is, playing the servant, the handy woman. My, how the mighty have fallen. Of course, Nardole immediately objects. While he might well have been the one to let her out last week, that was only because he was backed into a corner with no other realistic choice. Whereas here, this is just the Doctor pushing his luck. I don't know why, but I actually found myself a bit taken aback by how strongly Bill reacted to the new status quo. She's only really just met Missy, and while she has been given a glimpse as to how cold and ruthless she can be, and she has been told that Missy is a monster, there's something about her not actually having had that first-hand experience of actually witnessing Missy be, well, Missy, that makes me feel like it doesn't quite sit right to have her be so definitely against it. I can picture her going, well, from what I've been told, this is probably a bad idea, but speaking like she's an authority on the subject, I'm not so sure. And then of course you have Missy crying again, and what seems to be a genuinely heartfelt moment between her and the Doctor to round the episode to a close, continuing what was set up at the end of The Lie of the Land. The underlying constant with Missy since her introduction has been that she's always just wanted her friend back, which is why she's always so bitchy to his companions, because she feels like they're usurping her rightful place by his side. If this is all genuine and not just an act, that would certainly be a logical motivation for her wish to be good. Having said that, there is still that very clever idea she had that presumably involved Daleks, so who knows? How did she get off Skaro anyhow? You really want this to be real, because the Doctor wants it so desperately, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that
Missy wants it too. It's just that underlying memory that Missy is still the master that puts you in just enough doubt. You really want to feel for her because she seems genuinely remorseful, but you're not sure if you should. It's a real rollercoaster of emotions, this setup. All in all, I thought The Eaters of Light was a decent episode. Not necessarily my favourite, but I don't particularly have anything against it either. No offence to Ronan Monroe, but once again, the scene with Missy is easily the best part of the episode.
Which leads us to the finale. This is the bit where, had I got this video out on time, I'd have talked about my thoughts and theories on the upcoming finale. I even recorded them separately once this episode was written, and I realised I wouldn't get it out until after at least the first part of the finale had aired. After all, I wanted them to be genuine, and I'm not exactly an actor either. This video is so late now that I nearly decided to dump the recording, but with my OCD, I couldn't do that after having built myself up to use it. That, and I'd have to rewrite or re-edit the next episode, where I refer back to them. That was when I had a better idea. Welcome to a brand new segment of the Fan Ramblings. Expectation versus reality. Title says all. Today we hear the questions, next episode we get the answers.
First of all, can I just say, great starting point. Let's test Missy to see how good she actually is at being good. What could possibly go wrong? I think this is definitely going to be the comic relief of the episode, as evidenced by certain quotations they've released ahead of its broadcast. When they released the "Hello, I'm Doctor Who" line in the Radio Times, I thought this was going to be the Doctor saying it. He's called himself things like Dr. Disco in the previous couple series, so I thought this would turn out to be the thing they were building towards with those names. The Doctor actually finally calling himself Doctor Who. Of course, that's turned out not to be the case, but I can't honestly say I'm all that disappointed I was wrong. It's like Missy knows, in a Deadpool-like way, that there's an audience at home watching them, an avid fan base that is sensitive to the smallest detail, and she's just doing this to piss us all off. Only Missy would be so irreverent as to actually go around calling herself Doctor Who. But that's the interesting thing with Missy. Is she really good, or is she still bad? Michelle Gomez teased the two masters as being like a two-headed master, and that something happens which is down to Missy just being dreadful. She just can't help herself. There's a moment where she just remembers that she's totally evil. And yet, Missy did seem genuinely hurt at the end of The Eaters of Light when the Doctor wasn't sure whether to trust her or not. Were Michelle's words just misdirection? I'm guessing probably not, given that advanced reviews have hyped this episode up as being mind-blowing in its curveballs. Namely, a scene that was removed from screeners for the first time since Death in Heaven, an entire mandate of things they're not even allowed to tease, the reveal of the Doctor's real name. I mean, surely not, right? That can't be about that, but really. And something, or some things, that some reviewers are worried could end up getting undone in episode 12. I'm thinking that last one could be what Michelle was teasing. I reckon it could be one of two things. Bill turns out to be evil and working for Missy the entire time, like I theorised at the beginning of the series. That's probably not going to happen. Or, Missy kills Bill. Like, actually kills her. And she actually dies. For real. No takebacks. Remember, there was that trailer where it ended on her saying, "Even if it kills me." Of course, the last time they dropped a hint that obvious, it did prove to be true, but only as a misdirect for Clara's true fate. Maybe that would be why they haven't done that much with Bill in terms of giving her a story to live out. Allow me to explain. Every modern era companion, as I've reiterated time and again, had a story with a particular end goal in sight. The companion would start off lacking something that they would develop over the course of their travels with the Doctor, finally taking their final step into becoming the best version of themselves
in their final episode. Rose lacked interest and excitement in her life, only to become the bad wolf in Series 1. In Series 2, there's a slight subversion of the way the character arcs normally work, in that she and the Doctor begin to fall in love, only to be inevitably torn apart. But even so, this ending was the way this story was always going to end, just like the Bad Wolf in Series 1 and Martha in Series 3, her final episode as a companion being the moment she finally found herself and learnt not to carry on somewhere that she couldn't reach her full potential. Donna lacked any and all belief that she mattered in any way, only to become the most important woman in the whole of creation. Amy lacked faith in her relationship with Rory, only to take multiple leaps of faith with him in their final episode. This is part of the reason why it was the correct decision to bring Clara back in Hellbent. She hadn't yet completed her journey, achieved her goal, claimed the thing she was lacking. It wouldn't have been fair to her, to Jenna, or to fans of the character for Clara to be the only one to essentially fail. The events of Hellbent allow her to complete her character journey and stand proud alongside the other magnificent companions of New Who. This whole time with Bill, I don't really feel like she's been lacking anything. She obviously has the whole thing with her mum and what have you, but she doesn't let that rule her life. She's perfectly comfortable with her sexuality, only getting awkward about it when talking to people in the past who may not be as understanding or liberal as we are today, or when letting down an attempted suitor. The Doctor takes her on because he finds her interesting as a person and thinks she has great potential in her, but I've never gotten the impression from her that she feels she has nothing to offer or is worthless in any way, like Donna felt about herself. Even when she tells the Doctor that what they've been through has been the only interesting thing, I'm not entirely convinced that she's bored by her Earth life, as she seems to have some pretty decent nights out with her friends, which she would seem to have plenty of. Even the idea of her being the Doctor's personal student / apprentice has kind of faded since the end of Thin Ice, in the wake of all the threats of the week. At the risk of being mean, pretty much the only thing I ever see people say about Bill is how refreshing she is after having had 3 super universally important women in a row. But once she's been around for a while, and you've gotten used to her, she ceases to be refreshing. So what else does she really have to offer? The only other thing she really seems to have going on is being extraordinarily ordinary, which is why I thought maybe she'd turn out to be a villain. It's misdirection 101, just like they did with Clara in Series 9, or even Series 7. Make them think she's going to die for certain when she's not going to. Make them think she's this incredibly mysterious and complicated, impossible thing, when really she's just an ordinary girl. Make them think Bill's a completely ordinary girl, only for her to turn out to be a maniacal supervillain. Maybe all of this lack of lacking something is a result of them intending to kill her off in a very permanent way. In other words, let's not bother doing too much with her, because she's only going to be here for a little while anyway before she dies. This would make killing her off a little safer, for lack of a better word, and it also means you don't end up with the problem of her ending up being the only one to fail in her goal, because she didn't have a goal in the first place. You can decide for yourselves which you think is worse. Of course, Moffat has been criticised for undoing things in the past, and in past finales, like bringing back Gallifrey, resurrecting the Brigadier, saving Clara, etc. But that didn't exactly stop the majority of the fan base being genuinely duped by Face the Raven. So I shouldn't let worries about things getting undone hinder your ability to get invested in the story and its stakes, because for all its stupidly obvious flaws, this episode proves that it's still possible to get invested, even with Moffat's reputation. Also, consider the fact that Danny Pink was the only character not to make it out of Death in Heaven alive, despite that episode's events being set in motion by the mission to undo his death. Moffat was relying in that episode on our expectation of him to undo deaths to make it surprising when a death occurred that wasn't undone.
This could be his chance to do the same thing again here with Bill. Maybe that's what he's planning. Maybe he's relying on the same expectation again. Of course, we'll just have to wait and see whether I'm right or not. But it could honestly go either way, I think. To be honest, I'm more worried about him contradicting the audio story Spare Parts, released by Big Finish in 2002. This is the genesis of the Cybermen story that Peter Capaldi's been campaigning for ever since he got the job as Doctor Who. Not realising, of course, that it's already been made. Moffat went to the trouble of more or less canonising the Big Finish catalogue when he had the 8th Doctor reference his Big Finish companions in The Night of the Doctor, which was the impetus for me to start getting into their stuff, and I imagine that's been the case for many other fans as well. Bearing this in mind, I've sort of half convinced myself that he won't now go back on that move by blatantly contradicting one of the most loved and popular stories ever. Also bearing in mind that the episode is set on a ship, not Mondas itself, like in Spare Parts. But then you see Mondas in the trailer, and it just gets me worried all over again. We're finally at a point where the different creative teams will actually acknowledge each other's work for the most part, like Titan Comics using the Big Finish screwdriver in their 8th Doctor comic, and having their Torchwood comics set in and around the events of Big Finish's audio plays. It really annoys me when you have something like Spiral Scratch, which was, for a time, definitively the 6th Doctor's regeneration story. Then Big Finish come along and do their own one 10 years later, which contradicts it. While I do think their decision to make the Valeyard the 6th Doctor's final nemesis was a better choice of villain than the book, I do have to wonder why it was that they couldn't have just done the novel adaptation of it. I guess there must have been some reason, but I don't know what. I don't like having to sort the different bits of Doctor Who media into separate timelines, because I feel like that defeats the point of it all being one long, continuous story about the same time-travelling, monster-battling character. It defeats the whole point of Matthew Jacobs' efforts to get Sylvester McCoy back for the TV movie, when everyone else wanted to have Tom Baker open the story and regenerate into Paul McGann. That would have created a Star Trek Kelvin timeline-esque alternate Doctor Who, a reboot rather than a continuation. The whole point was to bring back the old Doctor Who and make more of it, not make a new Doctor Who from scratch. I'm probably worrying over nothing. This could be a story that takes place concurrently with Spare Parts, just in a different location. But being a bit OCD about continuity stuff, despite the fact that I know Doctor Who continuity as a term is a complete oxymoron, I just have my concerns, is all. On the subject of the Cybermen, we've seen from promo pictures that the current models and the 2011 models will also be appearing. The latter is definitely an interesting addition, as there is some debate as to what their exact origins are, looking as they do almost identical to the Cybus Industries ones from the universe next door, but lacking the Cybus logo on their chests. I just assumed that this meant they were the Cybermen from our own universe, plain and simple. But some people subscribe to the theory that the reason they look so similar to the parallel ones is because they met up and exchanged technology, essentially merging into one species. Nightmare in Silver certainly implies that, at the very least, the current models are a merge of the two, with the presence of both the Cybersmen and the 2011 Cybermen. Personally, I don't see why it's necessary to explain the appearance of the 2011 Cybermen in a way like this. Mickey and Ricky looked identical. That's just how parallel universes and parallel entities work. Surely that's all the explanation you need as to why the 2011 Cybermen look the same as the Cybersmen. I don't know. The point I'm getting to is that I'm wondering if the presence of the 2011 Cybermen in this episode means there'll be a confirmation one way or the other as to what exactly they're supposed to be. Whatever happens, I really hope it's good. It normally is, to be fair. I really enjoyed the finales of Series 8 and 9. That's both parts of both those stories, by the way. So, I've got no reason to doubt I'll like this one. I haven't even touched on how awesome it's going to be to see John Sims' master rocking the old Delgado beard. And he's got his laser screwdriver back.
I love that new costume he's rocking too. Very mastery. Ooh! If Bill turns out to be evil, could she be the Master's daughter? Oh my god, this is gonna be so awesome. Well, that's all for now, folks. Be sure to leave your comments and finale hopes and expectations down below. Keep it courteous, people. Manners cost nothing. Until the next time, where I'll be going over how the finale finally turned out.